Korean War, Operation Ripper, March 7, 1951 through April 4, 1951, by Scott Orders, Eli Hammond, Colin Gleason, and Jake Stafford. Operation Ripper. Operation Ripper was conceived by the U.S. 8th Army General Matthew Ridgway during the Korean War. During this time, the Department of State and the Department of Defense in the U.S. agreed that the main focus of the war was not military victory, but rather a ceasefire. Of course, how they were going to go about this wasn't really decided, but there was a general agreement that any negotiations would happen after the operation. During Operation Ripper. Operation Ripper was preceded by the largest artillery bombardment of the Korean War. South Korean and UN forces won the battle by recapturing Seoul for the fourth and final time, making it the last time the capital changed hands since June 1950. Following the recapture of Seoul, UN and South Korean forces pushed towards Hongcheon and Chuncheon. The capture of Chuncheon would be significant as it seemed to be used as an important enemy supply center. Hongcheon was captured on the 15th and Chuncheon was captured on the 22nd. These are the ruins of Seoul as in September 1950, and this is Chuncheon today.
Just some quick statistics. The battle lasted a little under a month, from March 6th to April 4th. The winner of this particular battle was the South Korean side, the side that U.S. was sided with. There was around 3,220 U.S. soldiers injured and 566 dead. But fortunately, there were 7,500 North Korean and enemy soldiers dead, and a little over 1,000 captured.
Geography. Operation Ripper took place in and around the city of Seoul and Hongcheon and Chuncheon Sea, all South Korean cities. Also very close to the 38th parallel, which is where the war began. Two very significant rivers that also played a role in Operation Ripper were the Han River and the Imjin River. And as you can see below, the photo on the left is a map of Seoul. The photo in the middle is a map of Hongcheon, and the photo on the right is a map of Chuncheon Sea and where they all are in South Korea. Geographical strategy. In Operation Ripper, instead of making a direct move across the Han River to Seoul, the main goal of Operation Ripper was an attempt to outflank Seoul and the area north, but even as far as the Imjin River. General Ridgway then hoped to gain Seoul by attacking them from the east, or with such a significant threat that it forced the Chinese and North Korean forces to withdraw from the battle. Then, the final goal was to push the Chinese and North Korean forces back to the 38th parallel. And as you can see, the picture on the left shows where the Han River is. The middle picture shows where the Imjin River is. And the picture on the far right shows the 30th parallel and the way it separates North Korea and South Korea, along with where Seoul is compared to the 30th parallel. The map portrayed here is the official map of how Operation Ripper went down. The map shows all the movement during the battle, including where and during which week the movement happened and the pass that they went in.
The leading up to the battle from 1945 to 1949. When looking at what led to the Korean War and Operation Ripper, communism is the main reason. In addition to that, Japanese occupation in North Korea was another main reason. The domino theory during the Cold War also had an effect on the Korean War. The domino theory said that after one country fell into communism, the surrounding countries would follow. Although the United States never fell into communism, it was constantly surrounded by it, which is another reason why the United States joined the Korean War. The prelude on Operation Ripper, from 1949 to 1951. In Korea, conflict over who owned the peninsula was between Japan and Korea, which is why Japan invaded them. In addition to that, North Korea invaded South Korea to take over the land, which sparked United States involvement. Wrapping up, the Korean War was a complicated one, but the United States' involvement made the war a lot easier for everyone.
Some of the tactics used. The intent of General Matthew Ridgway's military strategy was to destroy a large portion of the combined Communist Chinese and North Korean forces, which were stationed around Seoul and nearby towns. The operation was an all-out campaign to recapture the standby military fort in Chuncheong, South Korea. Their general's plan was to push the Chinese troops back to the 38th parallel, which we had mentioned before. The operation was launched on March 6, 1951, but just after the final plan of attack in Operation Ripper. It was to overturn much of the Seoul and the areas in the north, including the banks of the Imjin River. Later on March 11th, the 9th Corps reached the first phase of the Idaho Line, and this made continued advancements over the next 3 days, including the need for heavy combat. Some other statistics. The U.S. and South Korean troops utilized the M46 and M4A3E8 tanks of Company A Line at Yangpyeong. The first hull and turret was painted tan, and then hundreds of small green squiggles were hand-painted over it. This was an intimidation method that they used, where they'd paint a pair of eyes and leering mouth with red lips and teeth on it, just to scare away the enemies and give a little bit of a feel for the war. And they both had .30 and .50 caliber machine guns mounted on the top near the turret. It's also near the hatch.
Outcomes of the Korean War. The short-term relevancy was that the South Korean capital was secured along with 2 other cities. The long-term relevancy was providing a capital for the damaged nation of South Korea, along with the foothold to secure the rest of the victories in the war. Of course, there was no actual military victory, but these smaller battles as victories played a major part in the negotiations of the current frozen conflict. As for how America benefited from the Korean War, it boosted GDP growth during the war through government spending, which in turn constrained investment and consumption. While taxes were raised significantly during the war, the Federal Reserve, which is the central banking system of the U.S., their logo is in the top left, followed an anti-inflationary policy, which are policies to counteract inflation, like monetary measures, fiscal measures, and price control. And eventually, price and wage control stabilized prices by the end of the war. Consumption and investment continued to grow after the war, but at a trend rate much lower than during it. And these are our sources.